So welcome everybody to our podcast series, Leading in a Climate Changed World. Today it is a great pleasure to be talking to Jonathan Gosling. Jonathan is Emeritus Professor of Leadership at the University of Exeter, engaged with several initiatives around the world aiming to encourage responsible leadership. In the UK, he is lead faculty with the Forward Institute, which aims to enhance the contribution of an enlightened elite in the nation's most influential large organizations. Jonathan also supports teams in frontline health services across Southern Africa as they find inventive ways to respond to emerging challenges, including those brought about by climate change. He was co-founder of the One Planet MBA and has researched how societies cope with imminent collapse. He is currently planning a one-week workshop on implications for initiative takers in Bristol in April 2020, and also a reading and writing retreat on spirituality in times of collapse. So huge welcome to you, Jonathan. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
And we were just having a little pre-conversation. I was very interested in one or two of the tales that brought you into this work around societal collapse and your experience of research that initiated at least some of your interest in this. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that. What brought you into this field?
Well, I've been working for quite a while in management and business education, leadership education, and I did a little bit of work with some old friends and colleagues at Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF International, on their strategy around their One Planet Leaders program, as they called it. And one part of the emerging sort of conclusions from that work was that we should try to develop management education, perhaps a new norm for management education that would require all courses, and particularly MBAs, to be cognizant, to admit, as it were, the assumption that we have only one planet, which sounds rather ordinary thing to do. But when you then subject an awful lot of what's taught on business programs, it really doesn't hold up to that assumption. By and large, what's taught in terms of economics, in terms of business policy, in terms of theory of the firm, marketing practices, consumer studies, and so on, all sort of assume, when you question it, that we have potentially 2 or 3 planets worth of resources, both in terms of the sources of resources and what happens to waste and things. And so as I started saying this in deans and directors meetings and the various accreditation agencies and so on, people clearly thought, well, it's a very sensible thing to do, to assume that we have only one planet. But on the other hand, it's really difficult to change what we're teaching and our view of what we're doing, and to change what turns out to be a fundamental lunacy at the heart of business education. And so I found, rather than bringing a sort of candle of clarity to my field, I was setting up quite a lot of anxiety and resistance, and so I, of course, anyway, employed as an academic, found myself researching things and trying to figure out what's important to look at in the field of leadership. And one of the things I started looking at was trying to understand what I saw as a shift in particularly the UK and Western Europe around our attitudes to authority and to the possibilities of change, the kind of futures that people look to, that came up around 2014, 2015, in particular, which is when the refugee crisis, so-called, was at its height, and people were moving out of Syria in particular and other parts of the Levant at very large numbers. And so I just got kind of curious about how this was affecting people's attitudes to politics, attitudes to leadership, to authority, what they expected of their leaders. And I really started to have a look to see, well, what's lying behind this this refugee crisis. We've of course we'd heard a lot about ISIS and about the breakdown in the Syrian sort of body politic and other parts of that region for a long time. And I asked a research assistant, I had a very competent, a qualitatively competent research assistant at the time, to go and look for the rainwater figures for the last 10 years in the Levant. And she went away and came back a few days later and said, I can't find any. I said, well, that's ridiculous. There must be some. And she looked again, and then eventually we went to the Met Office, who are based here in Exeter, and colleagues who work for them, and they confirmed that there really aren't figures for that part of the world at that time. I thought, why not? Well, of course, the answer was very simple, that it had been such a bad drought for about 8 years by then, that farmers and villagers and people living across the region had simply run out of energy and motivation to keep recording the weather stations. So there's actually a hole in the data, a gap in the data that corresponds with the collapse in agriculture and the way of life there. And of course, what we know now is that from around 2011 onwards, vast numbers of people were moving off the land because they couldn't survive anymore there, moving into Aleppo and Homs and Damascus and so on. And those cities simply couldn't cope with the extra numbers, and this really gave rise to the intensification of the collapse of the city, of the state. And I then started looking at what's happening around the patterns of migration. Where were people going, and what was the response to where they went?
Is that particularly climate-related migration, or migration patterns in general?
Well, you can't really pull those apart, because as a place becomes people become so hungry, things fall apart.
Right.
Generally. And if you had a really robust state with plenty of money, with industries that could trade and buy food where it's needed and import water, and you had public officials who were trusted and able to organize a system that could organize relief and all those things, where you have a robust functioning state, you are of course more resilient to those kinds of pressures. But where you have somewhere where the central authority is not so trusted, and where you have in many ways a kind of divided state and a division between the state and some parts of the population, and you have such severe pressure on agriculture in particular, so people are hungry and thirsty for very basic needs, there's nowhere else really to go in that case. So I think, clearly it is climate change related, but that's not the only part of the story.
Right. So it's a fascinating way in a way, to look at leadership and climate change through the migration patterns, and also what you were noticing around that. And I'm also very interested in the response that you found in students on your MBA program, because we ran once a communication module for an MBA. And it was like we thought a stellar kind of communications module, and it was about purpose and communication with empathy and presence and voice work. Many things that were kind of fascinating. We thought in a great communications piece for a week. And then at the end of it, some of the students on the course, they said, well, this is all very well, but what we really want to know is how can we go and ask for a pay rise and get a yes? So I'm curious what the response has been from the students on MBAs about the kind of one planet focus that you've been bringing, and how's all that gone for you and for them?
Well, the One Planet MBA survived for, I think, 7 years, and then was closed down at Exeter. And I think the reasons are, as much to do with internal institutional politics as anything else. But also, it's true that it failed to act as a kind of magic bullet for recruitment. That students or potential students were many of them were really interested in the program, in the idea, and committed to it, but they were not sure that employers would see in the same way. And to take a break out of your career, to stop, and often at a time when you've got a lot of demands and you've got probably a new family, or you're looking for buying a house and all those things, people can't afford to take something that's going to be a higher than average risk in terms of future employment. And they perceived it that way.
Maybe you could say more about what the risk is, because so instead of people feeling that they were going to be ahead of the curve, they felt that they were diminishing their career prospects.
They did, and we didn't put in enough effort, or maybe we did, but we just weren't successful in getting sufficient number of employers interested in saying, yeah, I would really like to hire people with a One Planet MBA. That's who we need to employ.
And how did you feel about that? Because that's very kind of depressing, isn't it?
Well, I think no, I felt depressed and angry and let down in some ways by partners and colleagues and that, but also the world has changed a lot in the last couple of years, and we started that program in 2010, and in those first few years, still, an interest in sustainability was seen as a sort of corporate social responsibility, sort of not core business kind of concern. I mean, the simple answer would be to say we were 10 years ahead of our time from that point of view.
Right. So do you think it's ripe to, like, if and I'm not saying you're going to do this as an initiative again, but if that kind of initiative were born now, you feel there'd be a different response?
I would hope somebody listening to this podcast will say, let's have another go. I'm up for it. Right. We set up an organization called One Planet Education Networks, Open, which includes a sort of fellowship of people who are involved with that initiative and who have been supporters of it and backing it. And we're kind of ready to have another go at it with all the lessons that we learned from that and
great
different environment.
So if we were now to broaden the comment, I wish you luck with that also, maybe somebody will pick it up from the podcast. But if we were to broaden this conversation now into leadership in general, like at this time, what are you noticing in terms of kind of trends in leaders? Who are the early adopters, or maybe relatively late adopters, but in these terms, kind of early adopters of what's needed around the climate emergency? Where are you seeing leadership emerging that's got the breadth of understanding, the courage, the commitment to make the decisions that are needed now?
I think if I could take a couple of steps back and locate my answer in the sort of starting point for the deep adaptation movement and sets of papers, which I think has been quite helpful in setting out let's say a basic starting point, was that, and the kind of catchphrase is that collapse is inevitable, catastrophe is likely, and extinction is possible. And it's kind of dramatic, and it's perhaps a little bit neat, but the key point is the first one, that collapse is inevitable. And I think this has been a topic I've been studying and looking at for a long time, thinking about how the process of cultural collapse and how people respond to that. In many cases, when cultures do collapse, it's usually because of a combination of environmental factors and invasion and colonization. There are there are quite a few patterns that become recognizable when you look across. So and I'll come back to those in a minute. I think the question of whether collapse is understood to be a sudden and catastrophic event or series of events that all happen within a few months of each other, as some people say, is one thing. Another is if it's a kind of intense and continuous but kind of gradual collapse. And some commentators may feel, and perhaps with good reason, that we may be in that kind of process at the moment in terms of the collapse of trust and confidence in long-lived institutions and in authorities, structures, and processes by which we give legitimacy to inequalities of power. So in that sort of long-run collapse idea, maybe it's happening already, and the responses to this, whether it's a long-run slow collapse or a sudden collapse, they are perhaps rather different. If we think about the UK, Northern Europe, the US, Australia, most of the, let's say, the Northern Hemisphere by and large, you could probably say that we are in a process of certainly significant change and a kind of shaking. Maybe some of the bricks are falling out of the houses of these institutions. And perhaps there are opportunities to mitigate that collapse in the face of and alongside the steps we take to adapt to changes in the climate, which are amongst the many pressures on these structures, social structures. And that kind of response is response not to a crisis, but to a kind of long run process. And the leadership of that is primarily to do with what I call revelation. It's about kind of revealing the processes that we're caught up in. So it's, in other words, it's understanding what's happening.
And right, beautiful. And who is doing that?
And I think we see that very visibly done by movements like Extinction Rebellion, who are creating urgent events to kind of open our eyes to what's happening. And really, the core message and sort of the clarion call of Extinction Rebellion is recognize the truth of this.
Right.
And then it's recognize this is happening, recognize we need to do something about it, and let's start talking in a realistic way, the citizens' assemblies, about it. So I think this is one example of an assertion that the kind of leadership that's needed is leadership that helps us really understand what we're in, the situation we're in. There is a different kind of response, which is perhaps more likely to arise in a rapidly critical kind of situation when things literally fall apart around us, which is a desire, a profound and immediate desire for salvation. And this is not absent at the present, I have to say, even in this relatively slow run process we're in now. And the kind of response for salvation is not something like, I need to understand what I'm caught up in, which is likely to be very complex and no simple answers and so on. It's not that. It's just take me out of it. Take me out of it. And that might be done by scapegoating, by get rid of the people who carry, or whoever it is, whatever forces it is that carry the problem here. And these might be, obviously, often people look at immigrants, and we see that in the US and the UK and across Northern Europe and in Australia and many other places. It might be people who are wrong thinking in various ways. It's the Democrats or it's the Republicans or whatever. And it might.
So would you say we paint people or a group of people as other, and then we say we don't want to have anything to do with them, and they're the problem, and if we can just get rid of them, then we're going to be fine?
Yeah, yeah. It's a kind of simple answer. I mean, like just like the idea that the financial crash was brought about by a few bad apples, as it were. There's a few individuals who misbehave, but basically things are okay. Well, they're
So
not.
it's a refusal to look at the systemic nature of this.
And the complexity of it. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And of course, I'm conscious of my own response to this is that at the moment I have the luxury to carry on day by day, reasonably sure that the shops will be open and be full. There'll be food there this week and next week, and I can think about the complexity of the circumstances we're in. Whereas if suddenly there weren't any of those things, I might also be calling for, for heaven's sake, sort it out. Somebody sort it out. Which, as I say, might be about scapegoating those who I want to blame for the situation, or seeking a strong leader. Somebody sorted out is seeking, rather than revelation, just seeking a salvation. Somebody, a kind of command response. Somebody take control.
I mean, do you think, just to follow that for a moment, because some of the critiques of, I have a lot of time, as many people on these podcasts do, for Extinction Rebellion, but one of the criticisms that I've heard levied, well, there are two principal ones. One is the notion of panic. Like there's a kind of, we need to panic. And actually often when people panic, you don't really innovate and get creative. You just get frightened. So there's a question about that. But also in what you're saying about the call for strong leadership, like because a lot of it is focused on the need for government to act. Like when will you wake up and do something? Some people that I've spoken to say, well, it's a bit disempowering because it's kind of, we're basically going to end up with kind of authoritarian dictatorship. Maybe maybe it will come under a guise of being enlightened, but actually, we're giving away our power and asking everybody else to solve it for us. So how do you bring those two together? It's where kind of revelation and salvation meet a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that terminology, I'm kind of borrowing from a guy called Gordon Lawrence, who wrote a paper about what he called the politics of salvation and the politics of revelation. He was really talking about the relationship between clients and consultants. But I think by talking about these as politics, it's quite helpful because you're talking about power relations and how those get structured. And I can't say, I don't have enough knowledge to say whether Extinction Rebellion and other movements like those are primarily are really kind of sunk by these two features that you describe. But my sense is that the politics of Extinction Rebellion is very lively, and that the distribution of power and the problematization of power and influence is very live and debated and contested. And I think where that happens, it really is a good sign.
Yeah.
And people are, in my experience, practicing that all the time.
No, I like that. Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm just to follow this revelation strand, because you said that's the kind of, this is showing the world what is actually happening. Do you feel, or are you aware of companies, businesses, leaders who are also doing that? Like this is also about transparency in your supply chain. This is where we source our energy from. This is disclosure platforms saying, we're disclosing our use of water and forests, and that's part of the movement, right? Is to disclose and be transparent as a company. And I'm wondering if you know of if you feel like that's gathering momentum, or you also feel that there are particular individuals in that space that you think are doing a good job on the revelation front.
Yes, I think in a sense it's kind of revealing their practices and their inside works. There's some great stuff happening. I think as Marks and Spencer just announced this week, was it that they're going to publish openly all their sourcing for everything they do, and then you have people like EasyJet who have been unilaterally saying they're going to offset all their the carbon produced from all their flying operations, and saying, look, we know this isn't good enough. We know that we're still flying, but we've got to start here, and this is what we can do. And these just things, I don't think this would have happened a couple of years ago, and so.
KLM apparently they question you if you really want to fly. Like when you go, yeah, there's places where they also link to train journeys. So kind of when you arrive, you can also travel by train. But on the shorter haul flights, they're saying, do you really want to fly, or can you take a train?
Yeah,
And that's interesting for an airline to do that.
definitely. Yeah. So these things are starting. I think by revelation, I'm talking not only about kind of revealing the inner workings, about transparency in that way. I'm talking about processes. Well, a sense that what leadership is a leadership in understanding. Someone might say, "Well, you would say that you're an academic, you know," but nonetheless, I think it is important, and I think that's being done by all sorts of people. Of course, what I also wanted to say is I don't think that these exist, as it were, as two separate watertight categories. That, you know, amongst those of us, in a way, myself included, when I wanted to set up the One Planet MBA, that was, on one hand, a sense of saying, look, if we look at our business, our activity like this, as if we have only one planet and do our assumptions hold on to that, that is a sort of question about saying, well, this will reveal to us what we're doing and help us to do things differently and think and adapt to it. But I did also get very much into the politics of thinking, and this is going to save the world. It's going to save business education. It's going to, you know, there was a sort of salvationist timbre to my own communications and choices and working about that.
Right.
And so I think it's a useful distinction to make, but not to be too categorical about it.
No, I like it a lot. I think it's very helpful framing. And maybe we can also then bridge a bit into your other work around spirituality in times of collapse, because you've talked about the deep adaptation work, and you know the collapse is inevitable. So, and I'm also curious whether you brought spirituality at all into your One Planet MBA, or if you were to recast a One Planet MBA now, would it have a spiritual dimension to it? Maybe you could just talk to us a bit about that and how you work with that, and what the response is to spirituality in times of collapse.
So I think all MBAs, well, let's say all sort of post-experience, mid-career master's programs, are in any case dealing with, to some extent, people's search for meaning or for a new future, for new possibilities, new opportunities, which are all ways of expressing some aspect of searching for something a bit beyond. So I think I don't want to hone specifically on that MBA, but clearly the question, as I think it's coming to us now about this much more, is that it seems to be much more disturbing to contemplate the collapse of our whole society, our culture, and even extinction of our species, than it is to contemplate as individuals' mortality. That it's pretty sobering to think about one's own mortality, and also in some ways it can be very rewarding and thought-provoking and deepening. Speaking from personal experience, I presume it is for many other people as well. And thinking about one's own mortality has been a fundamental sort of route into and through what we think of as spirituality in many, many traditions. And this is to do with what we might call the more sort of inductive approaches of perhaps Buddhism and Stoicism and so on, as well as the more deductive sort of doctrines around religions of the book and things. But in addition to sort of thinking about one's own mortality, there's also a kind of reassuring confidence that as I can become more appreciative and understanding, become wiser about what really counts in life, that is somehow contributing to future generations, to my culture having a kind of weightiness, a substance, thoughtfulness, a profundity, a wisdom. But if I think, no, there's going to be nobody there to hold that, there isn't going to be another generation. I mean, nothing. That really is an abyss. And I think the spirituality, if there is such a thing around cultural extinction, is really problematic. I don't know what we do about it, but I really want to discover.
What do you mean when you say spirituality around cultural extinction is problematic?
What I mean is I'm not sure we have a kind of cultural. Well, I don't think we have a way of. Well, I mean, maybe there are ways of thinking and caring for, or for coming to a position where of complete non-attachment to the future of,
right,
even of the doctrines of non-attachment themselves. And I can understand. I mean, I certainly haven't reached that level in my own meditation to really know that for sure. And I can understand theoretically that profound meditative insight and enlightenment may lead to that kind of disinterestedness in.
Yeah, I understand the territory. And I'm also curious whether the work you do on spirituality in times of collapse would also include the spirituality that speaks to the interconnectedness of everything, that we're not sort of separate entities over here. So I'm having my kind of grieving process of my attachments and my personal experience, and you're having something over there. But actually, that part of what we need to do is sense the unified field out of which we are all emerging.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I think one of the papers I did, I worked quite a lot with Patrick Curry's ecocentric ethics, which I think speaks to that. It spoke to me anyway about that very much. And then connecting Richard Powers' book Overstory, which speaks for the knowledge in trees and forests and reframes, that it kind of makes the minuteness of human knowledge in relation to what's needed in order to live very evocatively for me. But nonetheless, the endings. What it means is that the ending of the human story is no end. It is not an ending, but it's a wiping clear of meaning in that sense. Well, anyway, that's. I don't really know how to say it or how to think it, but I'm learning how to think and perceive in that domain.
Yeah, and what I'm feeling is, and sensing in you and in this dialogue, is it's also about feeling it. Like maybe we don't have all the words for it and all the concepts for it, but to feel and dare to kind of look and feel the possibility of these endings that you describe. That's part of the journey also. And that's part of what we need in leaders, is the capacity to really feel deeply and not just have kind of quick fix solutions in the mind, but actually to feel it in the heart and body.
Well, maybe. I'm to be honest, I'm not that sure that has anything to do with leadership. I think that leadership is probably so caught up with power and influence on one hand, but also the expectations, the requirements of others of us, of those who speak for us or lead us or take command or interpret and so on, are are about a different set of things to spiritual things.
So that opens up a whole conversation. We could have another hour looking at that topic. But
well, let me put it very simply. I did a paper on this a few years back with my colleague Peter Case, and we concluded in that this was looking at leadership and spirituality, and started off looking at claims that more spiritual awareness, spiritual practice makes people better leaders. And that the fact if they're better leaders, you'll see their organizations being more healthy and sound and more productive and so on. And a number of, many models, experiments and so on have been done, and all this has been reported. I won't go into it all now, but the conclusion of our paper really was that you can look at the implied instrumentalism in that argument in a number of ways, because the instrumentalism says that spirituality is good because it's a good tool in making us better leaders, and that being better leaders is good because it makes our organizations more productive or healthy or whatever. And we said that, yes, there's some people are arguing that, and there's some evidence in some framings that spirituality is a valid instrument in increased productivity, whatever it is you're trying to produce. There's another argument which says, no, look, going to work and facing all the trials and tribulations, the temptations of work, wealth and power and so on, is good for your spiritual journey. Work is instrumental in your spiritual life. And that's the primary thing that's most interesting. And the conclusion is, many people have this experience that, look, this work is no longer helping me in my spiritual journey. It's just getting me down, or it's too simple, it's not challenging enough, or it's whatever, taking too much of my energy. I'll go and do something else. So that's an instrumental argument, also in relation to spirituality. But then there's another possibility that, spirituality is, in spiritual life, spirit, connecting spirit, is good in itself. It's got nothing to do with work, or its goodness is nothing to do with work. And similarly, leading and taking up a role, and leading initiatives, leading organizations, leading countries, politics, whatever, is a job of work to do. But intrinsically, it's got nothing to do with spirituality.
Well, I guess let's say we could have a long conversation about that, but I guess where I sit is to feel that spirituality is, and we could have a long conversation about what we mean by spirituality, but some kind of acknowledgement of the deeper rivers that run in us and the source of our own power and agency. Acknowledging that just brings me alive as a human being in a way that if I'm not aware of that, it doesn't. And that will infuse every aspect of my life. Partner, lover, father, leader, operative on a work assembly line, like whatever it is I'm doing, that will be infused with that awareness or not, depending whether I carry that awareness or not. So that's what I mean. So if people have a kind of an awareness of that and a sense of that, then they will bring that into any aspect of their life, including leadership.
Yeah, they might.
They might.
But that's not what justifies leadership, and so that's not what justifies spirituality. Sorry,
no, not at all. Absolutely, yeah.
And I think my challenge to you would be to really contemplate, stop and think about it. If that sense of spirituality and connectedness was really primary, the most important thing, would you really want to get caught up in leadership?
Well, it depends what your calling is.
Maybe.
And what I'm talking about is a fully embodied spirituality. It's not a kind of concept of spirituality. I meditate an hour a day, therefore I'm going to be a better person. No, it's saying maybe I have a spiritual awareness and a practice, but is it embodied in every cell of my being? And then that will also inform what my calling is. Maybe my calling is to be a leader, maybe it's to be a dancer, maybe it's to be a painter, maybe it's to be on the front line with Extinction Rebellion. I'll know my calling because I'm more awake to what I need to do in the world.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. So we could have anyway, I like the challenge. I enjoyed this part of our dialogue also.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we can close by just bringing us back in a way to some of the work you've also been doing with organizations, and just bring it back to the work you do with the Forward Institute. And just in a way to weave these strands together, like the One Planet MBA, the work on spirituality that you do. What finds its way into the work of the Forward Institute?
So the Forward Institute was set up in, I think, 2015, 16, to be a forum in which people who have quite significant roles and likely to have more significant sort of senior roles in big organizations across the British establishment. It's a UK-centric organization devised to address what was seen at the time as a kind of malaise in the establishment, which was a inward lookingness in different in specific organizations and sectors, so that to be very particular about it, the banking crisis showed a lot of situations in which people working in the financial services industry looked to others in the financial industry in order to judge what's good or right or acceptable behavior, with very little cognizance or value given to the systemic effects and whether this was considered legitimate more broadly, and the effects it had on long-term trust and optimism about the system and the world we're in. And so it's really designed specifically to address that, and address that cadre of people. Of course, bringing more responsibility into leadership and into our society, and bringing more humane priorities and so on, and addressing the key problems around inequality and climate change and resource depletion and all those things, is not dependent only on that rather elite group of senior people in those organizations. And the Forward Institute can't do everything, but part of a process of, I don't know, reform, rejuvenation in some ways.
So you find there's significant movement in the people that you work with through the Institute?
I think so. I mean, some people speak about, some of the people who participated in it speak about it as, sort of revelatory in some way, both in the sort of gentle way I've been describing it, perhaps even more. People can put their finger on a particular conversation or something that helped, that they feel they would be unlikely to have had in their normal life. And
right.
I think that the real sort of import of it is emerging as we now have close to 300 fellows, as we call them, across the establishment, who have spent significant time thinking about the systemic aspects and thinking about what really matters and what counts and where their legitimacy comes from, and the expectations they put on others and all those things. And we're beginning to see some really quite interesting, important things happening in the organizations for which they work, around climate change, mental health, life balance, priorities, decency in all sorts of ways. And we're now at the process of beginning to think, well, not only as a senior manager of Tesco or the Bank of England or Cabinet Office or whatever, but as citizens of the UK with significant amount of influence, and not only personal influence, but influence through your networks, including perhaps especially this network. What as citizens ought we be thinking about and trying to do and promote and make happen? I think it's, as I said, it's a very valuable and important part of a response within, as I say, the politics of revelation.
Yeah, that's great, Jonathan. Thank you. And maybe I'll just give you the last word to imagine yourself, because we're having this conversation at the time that the COP25 is happening in Madrid. And if you were there and you had the platform for 1 minute, 2 minutes to speak to the leaders who are gathered there, what would be a message you might want to give them? What would you say to them?
I would say something like, this is an emerging emergency, and that the responses must be now there's an opportunity for responses to be really a leadership that appreciates and helps us to understand and tackle and deal with complexity and systemic complexity, which is when people say we've got time to do things, that's what they mean. If we don't do that, we're going to have to move to other kinds of leadership, which is much more to do with command and autocratic responses at that level. And of course, at community level, I'm going off now what I have in my 30 seconds in front of the clock. At community level, a lot will depend on our ability to sustain local institutions and governance, communities and trust, in order, in some cases, to resist and at least to keep contesting that more centralized authority.
Yeah, great message. Thank you so much. And thank you for this time. I really enjoyed our conversation a lot. I found it very kind of rich and multidimensional. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the work you're doing in the world. And we wish you every success with that. And I'm sure our paths will cross again in the future, Jonathan.
I very much hope so. Thank you very much.